Abnormalities of one or more genes, particularly recessive genes, are fairly common. Every human being carries an average of 6 to 8 abnormal recessive genes. However, these genes do not cause cells to function abnormally unless 2 copies of an abnormal recessive gene are present. In the general population, the chance of a person having 2 copies of an abnormal recessive gene is very small, but in children of close relatives, the chances are higher. Chances are also high among groups that intermarry, such as the Amish or Mennonites. An abnormal gene may be inherited or may arise spontaneously as a result of a mutation to sudden change in a gene arising as a result of any one of a number of causes or for no apparent cause at all. Depending on whether the mutation affects the reproductive cells or not, the mutation may be passed on to future generations or may simply die out with the person who has the mutation. Whether or not a particular gene is abnormal can be a matter of interpretation. For example, the sickle cell gene produces disease, sickle cell anemia, but also confers protection against malaria. This so-called abnormal gene may therefore be of significant benefit in certain regions of the world. The effects of a single gene abnormality depend on whether the gene is dominant or recessive. For a dominant gene to be expressed, only 1 copy of the gene is needed. For a recessive gene to be expressed, 2 copies are necessary. Some genes, dominant or recessive, have only partial penetrance, meaning that even if present, they do not always or do not fully cause a change. Finally, all genes residing on the X chromosome, X-linked, are expressed in males. Only dominant ones are expressed in females unless 2 copies of a recessive gene are present. Because each gene directs the production of a particular protein, an abnormal gene produces an abnormal protein or an abnormal amount of protein, which may cause an abnormality to the cell function and ultimately in physical appearance or bodily function. The effect or trait produced by an abnormal dominant gene may be a deformity, a disease, or a tendency to develop certain diseases. The following principles generally apply to traits determined by a dominant non-X-linked gene. People with the trait have at least 1 parent with the trait, unless it is cancelled by a new mutation. Abnormal genetic traits are often caused by new genetic mutations rather than by an inheritance from the parents. When one parent has an abnormal trait and the other does not, each child has a 50% chance of inheriting the abnormal trait. However, if the parent with the abnormal trait has 2 copies of the abnormal gene, a rare occurrence, all of their children will have the abnormal trait. A person who does not have the abnormal trait but whose siblings do have it does not carry the gene and cannot pass the trait on to his offspring. Males and females are equally likely to be affected. The abnormality can and usually does appear in every generation. Dominant genes that cause severe diseases are rare. They tend to disappear because the people who have them are often too ill to have children. However, there are a few exceptions, such as Huntington's disease, which causes severe deterioration in brain function that usually begins after age 35. By the time symptoms occur, the person may already have had children. The following principles generally apply in traits determined by a recessive, non-X-linked gene. 140.